The wedding hall aboard Station Helios gleamed with crystalline decorations from a dozen worlds, and over 300 guests filled the observation deck, where the rings of Saturn provided a breathtaking backdrop through the transparent aluminum. Walls and Commander Jake Morrison stood at the altar in his crisp naval uniform, with medals gleaming under the soft lights, and he looked confident and proud as he waited for his bride to arrive. His bride was Lieutenant Amy Fletcher, and she walked down the aisle in a flowing white gown that seemed to shimmer with stardust, and she was a decorated pilot who was known throughout the fleet for her courage during the Outer Rim conflicts, and her auburn hair was swept up elegantly, and her green eyes shone with happiness as she approached the man she loved, and everyone in the hall watched her with admiration and respect. Among the guests sat Admiral Henry Fletcher, who was Amy's father, and he was a legend in the human defense fleet, and he was a man who had commanded fleets in 3 major wars and negotiated peace with 4 alien species, and despite his imposing military record, he sat quietly in the front row, and his weathered face was unreadable, and his gray eyes were watchful and calm. The ceremony proceeded smoothly at first, and the chaplain spoke of unity and commitment, and he talked about the bonds that held humanity together even among the stars. And Jake smiled at Amy, though something flickered in his expression that a careful observer might have found troubling, and Amy smiled back at him with complete trust and love in her eyes. When the time came for the vows, Jake took a deep breath and pulled out a folded piece of paper from his jacket, and Amy looked surprised but continued smiling because she assumed he had prepared something special for her, and the guests leaned forward with interest because personalized vows were always touching and meaningful, and everyone expected to hear beautiful words of love and commitment. Jake cleared his throat and began to read from his paper, but his words were not the loving vows everyone expected, and instead he launched into a detailed critique of Amy's career and her choices and her personality, and the tone of his voice was cold and condescending, and it made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. He said that Amy was standing there in that dress and playing the role of the perfect bride, but they both knew the truth, and he said she had spent more time in a cockpit than learning how to be a proper partner, and she had prioritized her career over everything else, and his words fell like hammer blows in the silent hall. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Amy's smile faltered and confusion flooded her features, and then hurt appeared in her eyes, and she looked at Jake as if she was seeing him for the first time, and she could not understand what was happening or why he was saying these terrible things. Jake continued, and he seemed oblivious to the shock around him, and he said he was doing her a favor by marrying her. And he asked what other man would want a woman who was more comfortable with a flight stick than with domestic life, and he said, her colleagues may call her a hero, but he knew better, and he claimed she was just desperate to prove herself because she grew up in her father's shadow. The color drained from Amy's face, and her hands trembled as she clutched her bouquet, and she glanced at her father, expecting him to rise in fury. But Admiral Fletcher remained seated, and his expression had not changed, though his eyes had grown colder and harder, and he continued to watch the scene unfold without moving or speaking. Jake's best man, who was Lieutenant Craig Porter, tugged at his arm and tried to stop him, but Jake shrugged him off, and he seemed to be gaining momentum and feeding off some twisted need to assert dominance and control over Amy in front of everyone who knew them. Jake folded his paper and said he was willing to overlook her flaws, and he said that Amy needed to understand that after today, things would change, and she would need to leave active duty and focus on supporting his career, and he claimed that was how things worked in a proper marriage, and his voice carried a tone of finality. The silence in the hall was deafening, and Amy stood frozen, and tears began to stream down her face, and the chaplain looked horrified and unsure whether to continue the ceremony or flee from the altar, and many of the guests looked at each other in shock and disbelief. Several of Amy's fellow pilots began to whisper angrily, and some stood up with their faces flushed with anger, and her maid of honor, who was Captain Lisa Grant, moved toward the altar as if to intervene, but a slight gesture from Admiral Fletcher stopped her in her tracks. The Admiral's hand had barely lifted from his knee, but the command was clear, and everyone who saw it understood that he wanted them to wait and not interfere yet, and Lisa stopped moving and returned to her position, though her jaw was clenched and her fists were tight at her sides. Jake noticed the movement of guests, and he seemed to interpret it as vindication, and he smiled as if he believed that his honesty was refreshing and that he was breaking free from social conventions that did not serve him, and he appeared proud of himself for speaking what he called the truth. He told the crowd that he knew this was unconventional, But marriages should be built on truth and not fantasy. And Amy needed to hear this now, rather than discover it over years of disappointment, and he claimed he was being the honest one while everyone else was just pretending and hiding behind polite lies. Amy found her voice, though it shook, and she asked Jake what he was doing and why he would say these things. And her voice was barely above a whisper, but everyone heard her because the hall was so quiet and tense. Jake replied that someone needed to say it, and he claimed that her father had raised her to be a soldier and not a wife, and someone needed to reshape her priorities and make her understand her proper role, and his words were filled with arrogance and certainty. At the mention of her father, several heads turned toward Admiral Fletcher, and the man was legendary not just for his strategic brilliance, but for his measured responses to crisis, and he had once negotiated a hostage situation by sitting in silence for 6 hours until the captors broke first and he had faced down an alien armada with nothing but carefully chosen words. Now he simply sat and watched as his daughter suffered the worst moment of her life, and some guests looked confused by his inaction, while others who had served under him began to understand, and they realized the Admiral was giving Jake Morrison enough rope to hang himself, and they waited to see what would happen next. Jake turned back to Amy with a mocking smile on his face, and he asked if they were going to finish this ceremony, or if she wanted to run back to Daddy, and the mockery in his voice was unmistakable and cruel, and he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and everyone in the hall knew it. Amy straightened her spine, and a familiar steel entered her posture, and she was her father's daughter after all, and she had faced enemy fire and made life or death decisions in combat, and she would not crumble now, even though her heart was breaking and her world was falling apart. She carefully set down her bouquet on the altar, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear, and she said no to Jake, and she told him they were not finishing the ceremony, and her words rang out across the silent hall like a declaration of independence. Jake blinked because he was clearly not expecting this response, and he asked what she meant and told her not to be dramatic, and he claimed he was just being honest with her, and she should appreciate his truthfulness instead of being emotional about it. Amy pulled the engagement ring from her finger and held it out to him, and she said he was not being honest but being cruel. And there was a difference between the two, and she declared that this wedding was over and she would not marry him. "Tila," crowd erupted in whispers and gasps, but Jake's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment, and he raised his voice and said she could not just cancel the wedding because she could not handle the truth, and he demanded to know if she understood how expensive this was and how many people were here. Amy replied that he should have thought about that before he decided to humiliate her in front of everyone she knew and respected, and her voice remained calm and controlled, even as tears continued to fall down her cheeks, and she stood her ground without wavering. Jake's expression twisted into something ugly and mean, and he pointed at her and said this was exactly what he was talking about, and she was too emotional and too impulsive, and she was proving his point right now with her dramatic reaction to his words. A deep voice finally spoke from the audience, and Admiral Fletcher stood up, and his tall frame unfolded with deliberate grace, and every eye in the hall turned to him, and the air seemed to crackle with tension and power, and he said that Amy was not proving Jake's point, but proving that she had self-respect, which was something Jake apparently lacked. Jake's confidence wavered for the first time since he began his terrible speech, and the Admiral's presence was commanding and intimidating, and he was a man who had shaped the destiny of humanity's expansion into space and negotiated with alien races and won impossible battles. The Admiral walked toward the altar with measured steps, and his dress uniform was immaculate, and his ribbons and medals told stories of sacrifice and valor and heroism, and every person in that hall knew they were in the presence of greatness, and they watched him approach with reverent silence. Jake stammered and said he was just trying to establish clear expectations, and surely the Admiral understood the importance of honesty in a marriage, and he tried to smile, but it came out as more of a grimace, and his hands shook slightly as he spoke. Henry Fletcher stopped beside his daughter and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and he looked at Jake with the same expression he might give a disappointing cadet who had failed basic training, and his voice was calm, but it carried an edge that could cut through steel and starship armor. He addressed Jake as Commander Morrison and said that honesty without kindness was cruelty, and leadership without empathy was tyranny, and a man who would humiliate his bride on what should be the happiest day of her life was no man at all, and his words were measured and precise. Jake's face went from red to pale in an instant, and he seemed to suddenly realize the gravity of his situation and understand that he was not just dealing with a hurt bride, but facing one of the most powerful men in the human defense fleet who could destroy his career with a single word. Jake said quickly that he did not mean any disrespect to the Admiral or his family, and he claimed he was just trying to be modern and break down old-fashioned ideas about marriage and gender roles. And he tried to make himself sound progressive and enlightened. The Admiral asked quietly if that meant suggesting his daughter abandon her career and mocking her accomplishments in front of her peers and implying she should be grateful that Jake would marry her. And he shook his head slowly as if dealing with a particularly stupid mistake. Admiral Fletcher turned to address the assembled guests, and his voice carried easily across the hall, without him needing to shout. And he said that many of them knew his daughter and had flown with her and served beside her and trusted her with their lives. He spoke of how Amy had earned her rank through skill and dedication and courage, and she had saved 17 lives in combat situations and mentored dozens of young pilots and helped shape the next generation of the fleet, and her service record was exemplary and beyond reproach. Pride emanated from his words, but there was something else too, and it was a controlled anger that made even the bravest officers in attendance sit a little straighter and pay closer attention, and they understood that the Admiral was building to something important. He continued and said that Commander Morrison believed these accomplishments were somehow flaws, and he believed that Amy should diminish herself to make him feel larger, and this told the Admiral everything he needed to know about Jake's character and his fitness as an officer and as a man. Jake tried to speak and defend himself, but the Admiral held up a hand and silenced him with nothing but a gesture, and the power of that simple movement was remarkable, and Jake's mouth snapped shut, and he stood there looking smaller and weaker with each passing moment. The Admiral said he had sat in silence for the past several minutes, and it was not because he condoned what was said, but because his daughter needed to make her own choice, and she could have proceeded with this farce of a wedding out of embarrassment or social pressure or fear of judgment. Instead, she had chosen to respect herself and stand up for her own worth, and that was the daughter he had raised. And he looked down at Amy with obvious love and pride, and she leaned into her father's side with tears still on her cheeks, but her head held high and her spine straight and strong. Captain Lisa Grant stepped forward from her position as maid of honor, and she had stayed silent until now, but she held a data pad in her hand, and her expression was grim and determined, and she looked at Admiral Fletcher and asked for his permission to speak. Henry Fletcher nodded once and gave his approval, and Lisa turned to face Jake with fire in her eyes, and she said that the Admiral and all the guests should know something else about Commander Morrison's behavior, because what happened today was not surprising to those who knew him well. She explained that over the past 6 months, Jake had been systematically trying to isolate Amy from her friends and colleagues, and he had made comments to other officers about how he planned to fix Amy once they were married and change her into what he wanted her to be. Jake's eyes widened, and he said that was not true, and Lisa was twisting things and taking his words out of context, and he looked around desperately for support, but found none among the guests, and even his own friends were avoiding his gaze. Lisa said flatly that she had recordings of his conversations, and she quoted him directly, saying that once the ring was on, Amy would have to choose between the fleet and him, and he would make sure she chose right, and his exact words were saved on her data pad. A collective murmur went through the crowd, and several officers who had seemed neutral before now looked at Jake with open disgust and contempt, and they understood that this was not just a bad moment, but a pattern of controlling and manipulative behavior. Lisa continued speaking and revealed that Jake had filed a request 3 days ago to have Amy transferred to a desk position at headquarters, and he cited family planning concerns as the reason, and he did this without discussing it with Amy, or getting her consent or even telling her about it. Amy's head whipped around to stare at Jake with shock and betrayal in her eyes, and she demanded to know if this was true, and asked how he could go behind her back like that and make decisions about her career without her knowledge or permission. Jake said desperately that he was trying to protect her, and combat missions were too dangerous for a married woman, and he was thinking about their future together and the family they would have, and he made it sound like he was being reasonable and caring. Amy shot back that it was her decision to make and not his, and she asked how he dared to go behind her back and try to control her life and her career, and she was furious now, and all her sadness had transformed into righteous anger. Admiral Fletcher's expression had grown even colder and harder, and he said he was beginning to see a pattern of behavior that went beyond poor judgment, and this spoke to issues of control and manipulation, and possibly even violations of military regulations regarding proper conduct. Another voice spoke up from the crowd, and Lieutenant Commander Paul Dixon, who was one of Jake's colleagues, stood reluctantly, and he looked uncomfortable, but determined to speak the truth, and he said that Admiral Fletcher should know something else about Commander Morrison. Paul revealed that Jake had been reprimanded twice for inappropriate comments toward female officers in his command, and nothing formal was filed because the women did not want to make waves, but it was in his record, and Paul had witnessed some of these incidents himself. The revelations kept coming, and what had started as a disastrous wedding was turning into a full exposure of Jake Morrison's character, and each new piece of information painted a darker picture and showed a man who was controlling and disrespectful and unfit for command. Another officer stood and said that Jake had once made a joke about how women should not be allowed in combat roles because they were too emotional, and he had laughed about it in the officers' mess, and several people heard him say it. Someone else mentioned that Jake had been passed over for promotion twice, and both times it was because of concerns about his leadership style and his inability to work effectively with female subordinates, and his commanding officers had documented concerns about his attitude. The weight of all these testimonies was crushing, and Jake looked around wildly as his reputation and career crumbled around him, and he tried to speak, but no one wanted to hear his excuses or his justifications anymore, and the damage was done. Amy stood there taking it all in, and she realized how lucky she was that this happened now, and not after they were married, and not after she had sacrificed her career and her independence, and she felt grateful, despite the pain and humiliation. Admiral Fletcher looked at the assembled crowd and said that he appreciated everyone's honesty and courage in coming forward, and this information would be compiled and submitted to the appropriate authorities, and there would be a formal investigation into Commander Morrison's conduct. He said that the military could not tolerate officers who abused their authority or who created hostile environments for their fellow service members, and integrity and respect were foundational values of the fleet, and anyone who violated those values would face consequences. Jake finally found his voice again, and he pointed at Amy, and his voice rose to a shout, and he said this was all her fault, and she and her precious career had made him feel like he was never good enough, and everything was always about her and her missions and her achievements. He continued his rant and said that Amy never made time for them, and it was always the next mission and the next deployment, and she never prioritized their relationship, and he felt ignored and undervalued, and that was why he said what he said. Amy asked coldly if his response to feeling neglected was to try to tear her down and make her small, so he could feel big, and she pointed out that was not love but cruelty and insecurity, and he needed to take responsibility for his own actions. Jake said he loved her, and for a moment he sounded almost sincere and vulnerable, and he claimed he just wanted her to choose him over everything else and be with him and support him, and that was not too much to ask from a wife. Admiral Fletcher stepped closer to Jake, and though he did not raise his voice, everyone in the hall heard him clearly, and he said that Amy served humanity and protected colonies and escorted refugee ships, and stood between innocents and those who would harm them, and that was not a flaw but honor. The Admiral paused and let his words sink in, and he said that the fact Jake saw Amy's dedication as competition, rather than as something to admire, told him that Jake never truly loved her, and he loved the idea of being connected to the Fletcher name, and he loved what he thought he could gain from this marriage. Jake's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out, and he looked like a fish gasping for air, and he looked around the hall desperately seeking any ally or any friendly face, but he found none, and even his best man had stepped away from him and stood with the other guests. Admiral Fletcher's tone shifted into pure command mode, and he said that here was what was going to happen, and this wedding was canceled, and any gifts would be returned, and any shared expenses would be calculated, and Jake would pay his portion without contest or argument. Jake said weakly that the Admiral could not just order him around because he was not Jake's commanding officer, and he tried to assert some kind of authority or control over the situation, but his voice lacked conviction, and everyone could hear the defeat in it. The Admiral agreed that he was not Jake's commanding officer, but Admiral Patricia Hughes was, and he gestured to a stern-looking woman in the second row, who stood up and her face was hard and unforgiving, and she looked at Jake like he was something unpleasant she had stepped in. Admiral Hughes said that she would be very interested to hear about all of this when she conducted Jake's next performance review, and her tone made it clear that his career was essentially over, and he would face serious consequences for his behavior and his lack of judgment. She continued and said that Commander Morrison should leave now, before this became an official matter, and before she was forced to place him under formal investigation and possibly court-martial, and her words were clipped and professional, but the threat was unmistakable. Jake looked around desperately one more time, and he saw only judgment and disappointment on every face, and some people would not even look at him, and others stared at him with open contempt and disgust, and he realized he had destroyed everything. Finally, with whatever dignity he could muster, Jake turned and walked down the aisle, and his footsteps echoed in the silent hall, and it felt like a walk of shame, and every step took him further from the life he thought he would have, and closer to an uncertain future. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back at Amy one last time, and she met his gaze without flinching, and her eyes were dry now and clear, and she looked at him like he was a stranger, and someone she had never really known at all. Jake left. The hall and the door closed behind him with a soft hiss, and for a moment nobody moved or spoke, and the silence was heavy and thick, and everyone was processing what had just happened, and trying to understand the magnitude of it all. Then slowly the tension in the hall began to ease, and people started to breathe normally again, and Amy stood at the altar, still in her wedding dress with tears drying on her face, and her father remained beside her as a steady and comforting presence. Captain Lisa Grant was the first to approach, and she wrapped Amy in a fierce hug, and she said she was so sorry Amy had to go through that, but she was so proud of her for walking away and standing up for herself and not letting Jake manipulate her into staying. Other officers and friends began to gather around, and they offered support and encouragement, and they told Amy she did the right thing, and she deserved so much better, and they would always have her back and support her no matter what. What had been planned as a wedding reception became an impromptu gathering of support and solidarity, and people shared stories about Amy's bravery and skill and kindness, and they reminded her of who she really was and what she meant to them. Admiral Fletcher raised his hand for silence, and when the room quieted, he spoke directly to his daughter, and his voice was gentle but firm, and he wanted to explain something important to her about why he had handled things the way he did. He said that Amy needed to know why he did not intervene immediately when Jake started his terrible speech, and it was not because he doubted her, or because he thought she deserved to hear those things, or because he did not care about her pain. He explained that it was because he knew she was strong enough to handle it, and he wanted to give her the chance to make her own choice without him swooping in to solve her problems and fight her battles for her and take away her agency and independence. Amy nodded, and understanding flooded her eyes, and she said she realized he was letting her be her own person and make her own decisions and stand on her own 2 feet, and she appreciated that even though it had been painful to experience. The Admiral said she was exactly right, and he told her she was not a little girl who needed protecting from every harsh word or difficult situation, and she was a decorated officer and a skilled pilot, and a woman of remarkable character and integrity. He said he knew she would handle Jake's behavior with grace and strength, and she did exactly that, and she proved what he had always known, which was that she was exactly the person she should be, and anyone who could not see that did not deserve her. The room broke into spontaneous applause, and people cheered for Amy, and celebrated her courage and her decision to walk away from a man who did not appreciate her or respect her, and the mood shifted from somber to celebratory. Lieutenant Commander Paul Dixon stepped forward, and he said that if Amy was interested, they were all heading to the officers' club, and they were going to have a reception anyway, and they might as well make it a proper celebration of her freedom and her strength. Amy laughed, and the sound was genuine and relieved, and she said that sounded perfect, and she would love to celebrate with her friends and colleagues and the people who truly cared about her and supported her and believed in her. As the guests began to file out and head toward what would become a legendary party in fleet history, Admiral Fletcher held his daughter back for a moment, and he wanted to speak to her privately before they joined the others. He said quietly that he was sorry her day was ruined, and he wished things had gone differently and she could have had the wedding she deserved with someone who truly loved and appreciated her for who she was. Amy shook her head and smiled at her father, and she said the day was not ruined but transformed, and she explained that she could have married Jake, and discovered all of this later, after years of trying to shrink herself to fit his expectations, and that would have been so much worse. She continued and said that instead she found out exactly who Jake was before she made that terrible mistake, and before she sacrificed her career and her independence and her sense of self, and she was grateful for that even though the experience was painful and humiliating. Amy squeezed her father's hand and told him that she also learned something important about him and about their relationship, and she learned that he trusted her to make her own decisions, even when it was hard to watch, and that trust was worth more than any perfect wedding. Henry Fletcher pulled his daughter into a rare embrace, and he was not usually demonstrative with his emotions, but this moment called for it, and he held her close and told her she was going to do extraordinary things with her life with or without a partner. He said that when she did find someone worthy of her, they would celebrate her strength and not fear it, and they would support her career and not try to diminish it, and they would be proud to stand beside her and not try to control her. Amy said that would be like how he had celebrated her mother and supported her mother's career as a diplomat, and she remembered how her parents had been partners in the truest sense, and how they had respected each other and lifted each other up. The Admiral agreed and said that was exactly right, and he told Amy that her mother would have been so proud of her today and proud of the woman she had become, and the officer she was, and the strength she showed in the face of cruelty and manipulation. Together they walked out of the empty wedding hall, and behind them, the rings of Saturn continued their eternal dance, and they were beautiful and indifferent to the small human dramas playing out against their backdrop, and the universe kept turning as it always did. They joined the other guests at the officers' club, and the party was already in full swing, and people were laughing and telling stories and celebrating Amy's escape from a bad marriage and her courage in standing up for herself when it mattered most. Lisa Grant had organized everything quickly, and she had contacted the caterers and arranged for all the wedding food to be delivered to the club, and the champagne was flowing, and music was playing, and it felt like a real celebration instead of a disaster. Amy walked into the club still wearing her wedding dress, and everyone cheered when they saw her, and they raised their glasses in a toast to her strength and independence, and several people made speeches about her character and her service to the fleet. One of her squadron members stood up and told a story about a mission where Amy had saved his life and flown through enemy fire to rescue him when his ship was damaged, and he said she was the bravest pilot he had ever known and the best leader he had ever served under. Another person talked about how Amy had mentored her when she first joined the fleet and helped her navigate the challenges of being a woman in a male-dominated field, and taught her to stand up for herself and never accept less than she deserved. The stories kept coming, and each one painted a picture of Amy as someone who was skilled and brave and kind and dedicated, and who made a real difference in the lives of the people around her, and in the safety of humanity's colonies and outposts. Admiral Fletcher watched his daughter surrounded by friends and colleagues who genuinely loved and respected her, and he felt a deep sense of pride and satisfaction, and he knew she would be fine, and she would thrive without Jake Morrison dragging her down. As the night wore on, Amy changed out of her wedding dress and into her regular uniform, and it felt symbolic somehow, like she was shedding the dream of what might have been and embracing the reality of who she actually was and what her life would truly be. She danced and laughed and celebrated with her friends, and for the first time in months she felt light and free and unburdened, and she realized she had been carrying the weight of Jake's expectations and criticisms without even knowing it. Lisa pulled her aside at one point and apologized for not speaking up sooner about Jake's behavior, and she said she had suspected he was not a good person, but she did not want to interfere in Amy's relationship, and she hoped Amy could forgive her. Amy hugged her friend and told her there was nothing to forgive, and she understood why Lisa had stayed quiet, and she was grateful that Lisa had spoken up today when it really mattered, and provided the evidence that exposed Jake's true character. They talked about warning signs they had both ignored and red flags they had rationalized away, and Amy admitted she had sometimes felt uncomfortable with Jake's comments and behavior, but she had told herself she was being too sensitive or too demanding. Lisa said that was what manipulative people did, and they made you doubt yourself and question your own perceptions, and feel like you were the problem when really they were the problem, and Amy needed to remember that and never blame herself. The party continued late into the night, and eventually people began to leave, and they hugged Amy and told her to take care of herself and reminded her that she had a whole community of people who cared about her and would support her through whatever came next. Admiral Fletcher waited until most of the guests had gone, and then he approached his daughter and asked if she was ready to go home and rest and process everything that had happened, and she nodded and said she was exhausted, but also strangely peaceful. They walked through the quiet corridors of the station together, and the artificial lights were dimmed for the night cycle, and their footsteps echoed softly, and the Admiral put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, and she leaned into him gratefully. He told her to take a few days off and rest and recover and not worry about anything, except taking care of herself and processing her emotions, and he would handle any administrative issues that came up regarding the canceled wedding. Amy thanked him and said she thought she might visit her mother's grave and spend some time there, and talk to her mother about everything that happened, and she always felt close to her mother in those quiet moments of reflection. The next morning, Amy woke up in her quarters, and for a brief moment she forgot what had happened, and then the memories came flooding back, and she felt a wave of emotions wash over her, but surprisingly the dominant feeling was relief, rather than sadness or regret. She got up and looked at herself in the mirror, and her eyes were a little red from crying, but she looked stronger somehow, and more herself than she had looked in months, and she realized Jake had been slowly erasing parts of her personality, and she was starting to get them back. Amy spent the day alone, and she walked through the quiet sections of the station and thought about her life and her choices and what she wanted for her future, and she felt a sense of clarity that had been missing for a long time. She visited the observation deck where the wedding had been held and stood there looking out at Saturn's rings, and she remembered standing there in her wedding dress just yesterday, and how different everything felt now, and how much had changed in such a short time. A cleaning crew was removing the last of the decorations, and they worked quietly and efficiently, and one of them recognized Amy and gave her a sympathetic smile, and she smiled back and thanked them for their work and kindness. Amy thought about Jake and tried to understand what had happened and why he had behaved the way he did, and she wondered if he had always been that person, or if something had changed him, or if she had just been blind to his true nature. She realized that there had been small signs throughout their relationship, and moments when he had been dismissive or controlling, but she had explained them away as stress or miscommunication, and she had wanted so badly for the relationship to work that she had ignored her own instincts. That was a lesson she would not forget, and she promised herself that in the future she would trust her gut feelings and pay attention to warning signs and never again try to make herself smaller to accommodate someone else's insecurity. The next few days passed quietly, and Amy received messages from dozens of people offering support and sharing their own stories of bad relationships and difficult breakups, and she was touched by how many people reached out to her with kindness and understanding. She also received a formal notification that Jake had resigned his commission and was leaving the military, and Admiral Hughes had given him the choice between resignation and a formal investigation, and he had chosen to leave quietly and avoid the scandal. Amy felt conflicted about this because part of her wanted him to face consequences for his behavior and be held accountable. But another part of her was just glad he was gone, and she would not have to see him or work with him anymore. Lisa came to visit and brought food and wine, and they sat together and talked for hours about everything and nothing, and Lisa told Amy that she was handling this with remarkable grace and strength, and she was going to come out of this experience stronger and wiser. Amy said she felt like she was grieving not for Jake himself, but for the future she had imagined and the life she had planned and the dreams she had built around their relationship, and it was hard to let go of those dreams, even when she knew they were based on false premises. Lisa understood, and she shared her own experience of a failed engagement years ago, and how she had felt the same way, and how it had taken time to heal, but eventually she had realized it was the best thing that could have happened to her. They talked about the nature of love and relationships and what it meant to be partners and equals, and Amy said she wanted someone who would challenge her and support her and celebrate her successes rather than feel threatened by them. Lisa agreed and said that was what everyone deserved, But not everyone was mature enough or secure enough to offer that kind of partnership, and it was better to be alone than to be with someone who diminished you or made you feel bad about yourself. The conversation turned to careers and futures, and Amy said she was thinking about applying for a special assignment that she had been considering for months, but had put on hold because Jake had not wanted her to take it. Lisa encouraged her to apply and said this was the perfect time to pursue her own goals and ambitions, without having to consider anyone else's opinions or preferences, and she should take advantage of her freedom and independence. Amy felt excited about the possibility, and she spent the next day working on her application and updating her service record and reaching out to people who could provide recommendations, and she threw herself into the project with enthusiasm. Admiral Fletcher checked on his daughter regularly, and he was pleased to see her engaged and forward-looking, and he told her he was proud of how she was handling everything and turning a painful experience into an opportunity for growth. He also told her that he had received several inquiries from senior officers who were impressed by how she had handled herself at the wedding, and word had spread throughout the fleet about what happened, and people were talking about her courage and dignity. Amy was embarrassed by the attention, but her father explained that this kind of reputation was valuable in the military, and it showed other officers that she was someone with integrity and strength, and that would serve her well throughout her career. The week after the wedding, Amy returned to active duty, and her squadron welcomed her back with a small celebration, and they had decorated her locker with supportive messages and funny drawings, and she laughed and cried at the same time. Her commanding officer called her into his office and asked how she was doing, and offered her any support she needed and told her to take more time if necessary. But Amy said she was ready to work, and being in the cockpit was where she felt most herself. She flew a routine patrol mission that afternoon, and the familiar feel of the controls under her hands and the view of space through the canopy made her feel grounded and centered, and she remembered why she loved this job and this life. Her wingman was a young pilot named Chris Baker, and he flew beside her with skill and precision, and after the mission he told her he was honored to fly with her, and he had heard about what happened, and he thought she was incredibly brave. Amy thanked Chris for his kind words and told him that everyone faced difficult situations in life, and what mattered was how you responded, and whether you stayed true to yourself, and she was just trying to do that and move forward with grace. 2 weeks after the canceled wedding, Amy received notification that her application for the special assignment had been accepted, and she was being offered command of a new experimental squadron that would test advanced fighter designs and tactics on the frontier. It was exactly the kind of challenge she had been hoping for, and it would mean promotion to the rank of commander and increased responsibility, and the chance to shape the future of combat aviation in the fleet, and she was thrilled and terrified in equal measure. Lisa was the first person she told, and her friends screamed with excitement and hugged her and said she absolutely had to accept, and this was an incredible opportunity, and she deserved it completely, and it was perfect timing. Admiral Fletcher was equally pleased when Amy told him, and he said he had known about the position and had actually written one of the recommendation letters, but he had not told Amy because he wanted her to earn it on her own merits without any pressure or expectations. He said the selection board had been unanimous in choosing her, and they had specifically mentioned her technical skills and her leadership abilities and her grace under pressure, and they thought she was exactly the right person to lead this important project. Amy accepted the position and spent the next month preparing for the transfer and saying goodbye to her current squadron and training her replacement and tying up loose ends, and it was a busy and exciting time. She heard through the grapevine that Jake had taken a civilian job with a shipping company and was working in logistics on a remote station, and she felt nothing when she heard this news, and that was when she knew she had truly moved on. The day came for Amy to transfer to her new assignment, and her squadron threw her a farewell party, and they gave speeches about her leadership and her skill, and what she had meant to them, and several people cried, including Amy herself. She promised to stay in touch and told them they had been like family to her, and she would always remember her time with them fondly, and she hoped their paths would cross again someday in the vast expanse of space. Admiral Fletcher came to see her off, and he walked with her to the docking bay where her transport was waiting, and they stood together in silence for a moment, and just enjoyed being in each other's company without needing words. He told her he was proud of her, and he knew she would do great things in her new position, and she should trust herself and her instincts and not be afraid to make bold decisions and take calculated risks. Amy hugged her father tightly and thanked him for everything he had done for her, and for raising her to be strong and independent, and for showing her what real integrity looked like through his own example. She boarded the transport and found a window seat and watched as the station grew smaller and smaller, until it was just another point of light among the stars, and she felt a sense of excitement and possibility about what lay ahead. The journey to the frontier base took 3 days, and Amy spent the time reviewing files about her new squadron and studying the specifications of the experimental fighters they would be testing and planning how she would approach training and team building. When she arrived at the base, she was greeted by her new executive officer, who was a lieutenant named Sam Torres, and he gave her a tour of the facilities and introduced her to the maintenance crews and support staff. The pilots of her new squadron were waiting in the briefing room, and Amy walked in and looked at the 15 men and women who would be under her command, and she felt the weight of responsibility, but also a sense of rightness. She introduced herself simply and told them about her background and her vision for the squadron, and she emphasized that they were going to be doing important and dangerous work, but also exciting work that would shape the future of the fleet. The pilots responded well to her direct and honest approach, and they asked good questions and showed enthusiasm, and Amy could tell this was going to be a strong team, and she was eager to start working with them. Over the next few weeks, Amy threw herself into her new role, and she established training protocols and safety procedures, and she got to know each pilot individually and learned their strengths and weaknesses and what motivated them. She flew test missions almost every day and pushed the new fighters to their limits and worked with engineers to refine designs and solve problems. And she loved every minute of it, even when it was exhausting and challenging. One evening after a particularly difficult day, Lisa called her and asked how things were going. And Amy talked for an hour about the squadron and the fighters and the challenges they were facing, and Lisa listened and laughed and offered advice. Lisa mentioned that she had run into someone at a conference who had asked about Amy and wanted to know how she was doing, and Lisa had given a glowing report and said Amy was thriving in her new position. Amy asked who it was, and Lisa said it was a captain named David Chen, who was working on deep space exploration missions, and he had served with Amy years ago on a training exercise and remembered her fondly. Amy vaguely remembered David and thought he had been nice and professional, and she told Lisa to say hello if she saw him again, but she was not really thinking about relationships or dating right now because she was focused on her work. Lisa laughed and said that was fine, but she should keep an open mind because the right person might come along when she least expected it, and she should not close herself off to possibilities just because of what happened with Jake. Amy agreed that was fair, and she promised to stay open to new experiences and new people. But she also said she was genuinely happy right now with her life and her career, and she did not feel like anything was missing. 3 months into her new assignment, Amy's squadron achieved a major breakthrough in fighter maneuverability, and their test results were so impressive that Fleet Command wanted to accelerate the production timeline and get the new fighters into service as soon as possible. Amy was invited to present her findings at a major conference on military technology and innovation, and officers from across the fleet would be attending, including many high-ranking officials, and she spent weeks preparing her presentation and making sure every detail was perfect. The night before the conference, Admiral Fletcher called her and they talked about her presentation, and he gave her some advice about dealing with skeptical senior officers and reminded her to trust her data and speak with confidence. He also mentioned that he would be attending the conference himself, and he was looking forward to hearing her speak and seeing her in her element, and he knew she would do brilliantly and make him proud, as she always did. The conference was held on a massive station near Earth, and hundreds of officers filled the auditorium when Amy took the stage, and she felt nervous for a moment. But then she saw her father in the front row, and Lisa sitting beside him, and she felt calm and ready. She delivered her presentation with clarity and passion, and she showed video footage of the test flights and explained the technical innovations and discussed the tactical implications, and the audience was clearly impressed and engaged. During the question and answer session, several senior officers asked challenging questions, but Amy answered them all with confidence and precision, and she could see people nodding and taking notes, and she knew her work was being taken seriously. After her presentation, multiple officers came up to congratulate her and ask follow-up questions and discuss potential applications of her research, and she spent hours in conversations with some of the most brilliant minds in the fleet. Admiral Hughes, who had been Jake's commanding officer, approached Amy and shook her hand and said she had done outstanding work, and her presentation was one of the best the Admiral had seen in years, and she predicted Amy would go far in her career. Amy thanked her, and Admiral Hughes said quietly that she was sorry about what had happened at the wedding, and she wanted Amy to know that Jake's behavior had been completely unacceptable, and the military had no tolerance for officers who treated others with such disrespect. She added that Amy had handled the situation with remarkable dignity, and that kind of character was rare and valuable, and it would serve her well throughout her career and her life, and she should never doubt her worth or her abilities. That evening, there was a formal reception, and Amy wore her dress uniform and mingled with colleagues and senior officers, and she felt confident and comfortable in a way she had not felt in a long time. She was standing near the window looking out at Earth when someone approached her and said her name, and she turned to find Captain David Chen smiling at her and holding 2 glasses of wine. He offered her a glass and said he had really enjoyed her presentation, and he remembered flying with her years ago, and he had always thought she was an exceptional pilot, and it was great to see her doing such important work. They talked for a long time about their respective assignments and their experiences in the fleet, and they discovered they had similar philosophies about leadership and similar frustrations with bureaucracy, and they laughed about shared experiences. David was easy to talk to, and he listened more than he spoke, and he asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely interested in what Amy had to say, and she found herself relaxing and enjoying his company. When the reception ended, David asked if Amy would like to have dinner with him the next evening, and she hesitated for just a moment, and then said yes, because she was curious to get to know him better, and there was something kind in his eyes that made her feel safe. They had dinner at a quiet restaurant on the station, and they talked for hours, and David told her about his work exploring uncharted systems and discovering new planets and the challenges and rewards of being so far from home. Amy told him about her squadron and her test program and some of the technical challenges they were facing, and David offered insights from his own experience and made suggestions that were actually helpful and showed he understood the complexities involved. At one point, David asked carefully if Amy was seeing anyone, and she told him honestly about what had happened at her wedding and how Jake had humiliated her, and she had walked away, and it had been difficult, but ultimately liberating. David listened, without interrupting, and when she finished, he said quietly that Jake must have been incredibly insecure and foolish, because Amy was clearly an amazing person, and any man would be lucky to be with someone so capable and strong and dedicated. He added that he believed relationships should be partnerships between equals, and people should lift each other up and celebrate each other's successes, and he had ended his own engagement 2 years ago because his fiancée had wanted him to give up his career, and he could not do that. Amy felt understood in a way she had not felt in a long time, and she appreciated David's honesty and his respect for her career and his clear understanding that work and love did not have to be in competition. They continued to see each other over the next few months whenever their schedules allowed, and they communicated regularly through video calls and messages, and Amy found herself looking forward to their conversations and feeling happy when she saw his name appear on her screen. Admiral Fletcher noticed the change in his daughter and asked about David and Amy, told him about their relationship and how different it felt from what she had with Jake, and how David supported her work and encouraged her ambitions. Her father met David at another conference, and they talked for over an hour, and afterward the Admiral told Amy that he approved, and he thought David was a good man with strong character and genuine respect for Amy and her career. 6 months after they started dating, David was offered a promotion that would bring him to a base near Amy's frontier station, and they would actually be able to see each other regularly and build a real relationship instead of conducting it mostly through screens. Amy's squadron had by this time proven the viability of the new fighter designs, and she received a commendation for her work and was promoted to full commander and given expanded responsibilities, and she was thriving in every aspect of her life. She sometimes thought about the wedding that never was and what her life would have been like if she had married Jake, and she felt nothing but gratitude that it had fallen apart when it did, and saved her from years of unhappiness. The story of what happened at her wedding had become something of a legend in the fleet, and it was used as an example in leadership training about the importance of character and integrity and treating others with respect and dignity. Amy Fletcher had become known not just as an exceptional pilot and officer, but as someone who had faced humiliation with grace and had chosen self-respect over social convenience and had turned a terrible moment into an opportunity for growth. She stood on the observation deck of her station one evening and looked out at the stars and thought about her mother and her father and all the people who had supported her and believed in her and helped her become who she was. Admiral Henry Fletcher had taught her through his example that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply stand beside someone and let them make their own choices and trust in their strength and their judgment. Amy knew that she would carry that lesson with her for the rest of her life, and she would try to offer that same trust and respect to the people she led and the people she loved, and that would be her legacy.